For the past few years, among other things, you've likely noticed three primary constants in our garden. We love garlic, we use mulch, and we need a fence. Now, we've covered the first two quite extensively already, but despite mentioning its importance several times per season, we've not actually made any real progress on completing our permanent enclosure. But by now, we've gotten fairly good at growing our food, so we figure it's about time we actually got a chance to eat some before the critters do. So in this video, we'd like to get things started by showing you how we put in our fence posts without the use of cement. But as hard as it is to believe, we actually completed that first step 3 years ago, which means that conveniently at the end of this video, we'll also be able to give you an update on how this method is held up over the seasons. But first, let's turn back the clock to a time before our potato patch, before our garlic, before our Back to Eden experiment, and even our Ruth Stout beds. All the way back to when our entire garden consisted of a single 4-foot by 30-foot hugelkultur mound. The year was 2016. We had just moved into our new home after nearly 2 years in a camper van and decided to put down some roots. Now, we learned a lot from that first hugelkultur experiment, but the most important lesson was the fact that if we ever hope to become fully food self-sufficient, we'd need to seriously expand our growing area and keep it protected from our furry new neighbors. So to solve both problems, we decided to put up a fence that would define what at the time seemed like a pretty ambitious perimeter, 50 feet by 50 feet. From what I recall, the exact dimensions were somewhat arbitrary. But since we liked the size of our first bed, we figured that if we were to construct, say, 5 more beside it, with nice wide paths in between, and a 3-foot path around the outside, that would give us a fence of 50 feet by 36 feet. But we also knew that we wanted more space for our corn, since during that first season we also learned that corn grows best in larger clumps. So what the heck, we rounded up to 50 by 50. Because it made for a nice symmetrical garden and would allow for an 8-foot by 36-foot patch of corn, and an even wider central path in between. So with the dimensions determined, our next step was to map it out on the ground. And we started with the side closest to the existing bed, because we simply had to measure out 3 feet from both sides and place our first corner where the 2 lines intersected. Then from that point, we could measure out 50 feet along the first line, and just like that, we had our first side complete. So we placed 2 stakes in the ground and connected them with some string. Then everything else could be based off of that. But luckily, that first hugelkultur mound was oriented north-south, which meant that the first side of the fence was 2. So to roughly figure out the 90-degree angle for the next 2 sides, all we needed was a compass. To do that, we simply aimed ourselves due west, measured out another 50 feet, and then placed the remaining stakes. Now, just as a quick tip, if you don't happen to have a compass, or if your garden isn't oriented the same way ours is, you can also ensure that your corners are square by using the Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. Or even better, just remember 3, 4, 5. Because if you measure out 3 feet in one direction and make a mark, then 4 feet in the other direction and make another mark, as long as the distance between the 2 marks is 5 feet, then you can be certain that your angle is 90 degrees. And once you're pretty confident about all 4 sides, you can also double check by measuring diagonally from corner to corner one way, and then the other. If everything is correct, then both measurements should be the exact same, which in our case was about 70 feet 8 inches. If they're not the same, that means that either one of the angles or distances must be off. Okay, now that our perimeter was mapped out, the next step was to mark the position of each post, but that was just a simple job of measuring along the string and then placing a stake every 10 feet. We chose 10 feet because we knew that our fencing material would be pretty lightweight, and more importantly, it would make for some simple math, because that would leave us with 5 posts per side for a total of 20. However, we also needed a gate, so we decided to add an extra post on either side of the opening to help support the hinges. These posts were spaced at 5 feet for a new total of 21. Alright, now to dig some holes. For this, we could have chosen from several different options. For example, many people might use a manual post hole digger. Or, as you can see, we could also use shovels, which we did, for about a minute. Because each of these 21 holes needed to be dug down about 3 or 4 feet, and it didn't take us long to realize that only using shovels would have kept us there for days. So instead, we decided to opt for a bit more power, in the form of this one-man post hole auger. which we rented from a home improvement store for about $40. Money well spent. Now, the ideal hole depth depends on a number of different factors, like the purpose of the fence, the type of fencing material, the depth of the frost line, and the height of the posts. But as a general rule, most seem to recommend that you dig down to a depth of about 1/3 to 1/2 of the post's above ground height. So for us, keep in mind that this is just a simple garden fence, meant to keep out small animals like rabbits and groundhogs, and to dissuade larger ones like deer. So we knew that the fence had to be tall, because deer can jump like 7 feet, but didn't have to be particularly heavy. Therefore, we chose a post height of roughly 8 feet, which meant a hole depth of somewhere between 2.5 and 4 feet. The only other major concern for us was the winter frost line, because if you're not below it, then the freeze-thaw cycle can actually push your posts out over time. Here in Ontario, Canada, the frost line is technically somewhere around 6 feet, but I believe even deck posts are up to code at around 4. So anyway, again, this is just a simple lightweight garden fence, so we decided that between 3 and 4 feet would be plenty. Okay. Moving on. Once all the holes were dug, next we needed to get our hands on some posts. And again, there were many options to choose from, but in the end we decided on cedar posts because cedar is naturally rot resistant, easy to work with, and most importantly, very abundant in our forest. However, rather than cutting any new trees, we chose to repurpose some of the old cattle corral that was constructed by the previous owners of our property. It was still made out of trees from our own land, but conveniently they had already been cut, trimmed, and dried. So, with the help of our nephew, who happened to be visiting that weekend, we dismantled the corral, measured the straightest sections, and promptly produced a pile of posts. Now for the final step, actually putting those posts in the ground. And once again, we had a number of different methods to choose from. But after considering the options, we decided to try a no-cement approach, because it's free, it's simple, and it's environmentally friendly. The basic idea is to secure the post in the ground using heavily packed earth. So to do this, you first set the post in the hole, then add a few inches of soil. Next, you use a heavy tamper bar to pack the earth until it becomes a hard and solid base. Then add several more inches and pack it again. Continue this all the way to the top, and from what we're told, this should provide a strong enough anchor to keep your posts upright for decades. Now, it's also important to note that this method works best if your soil has a high clay content, which ours does not. But despite that, the soil still compacted fairly well, and after only one layer, the post was already standing steadily without our support. We also found that adding just enough water to dampen the dirt also made it stick together and firm up a bit. Just be careful not to make it too wet, because mud doesn't pack well at all. Another tip is to let gravity do most of the work, because in the beginning I found myself swinging the bar downward, but that very quickly took a toll on my arms. However, by simply lifting and then dropping the bar, the resulting compaction was nearly the same, but it took far less effort on our part. Oh, and don't forget to check periodically with a level to ensure that your post is standing straight and vertical. This can be a bit difficult because cedar posts don't always have perfectly smooth sides, but once again, this is only a garden fence, so we tried not to be too picky. Anyway, after several minutes of filling and packing, we were done. Then at the top of the hole, we also did our best to angle the earth up into a cone shape. This was to hopefully shed any rainwater away from the post in order to prevent it from rotting over time. And that was it. Just repeat 20 more times and our posts were complete. So now let's fast forward 3 years and see how they're doing today. Well, the most important thing to point out is that they're still standing, and still pretty solid too. They do move a bit when I try and shake them, but that's actually due to the post flexing rather than any movement in the ground. Some of the angled earth is still obvious, though slightly eroded, and interestingly, much of it is still bare of grass, likely because of the extremely compacted earth. So overall, I'd say that they're doing pretty well, so far. But remember, it's only been 3 years. And from what we've read, most untreated cedar posts will last at least 5, even in the worst of conditions. And in the best, can last for decades. So we've still got a long way to go before we can claim that this is an absolute success. But either way, I'm still pretty pleased. Another thing that I should mention is that we didn't peel the bark off of our posts before putting them in the ground. At the time, we found a lot of conflicting advice online, and frankly, I'm still not sure if it does or doesn't make a difference. However, what I can say is that in my opinion, bare posts look much better. So I've been slowly peeling them over the seasons, which is a surprisingly easy and satisfying thing to do when taking a break from gardening. The posts are just so dried out at this point that the bark comes off effortlessly in long strips. And the freshly peeled posts look bright and colorful right now, but by next year they'll have a more weathered look, like these ones I peeled last season. And finally, the other pretty obvious thing that you'll notice is that our posts are still standing without any fencing material. And that's the lack of progress I mentioned at the beginning of the video. We did wrap them temporarily a couple of years ago, but as of yet, nothing permanent. So in the coming weeks, we plan to finally finish this darn thing so that it's ready for next season. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.